Okay, should we start? Yeah? Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session today. My name is Felipe Szabzon, and today with me is my colleague Delia da Mosto to interview our amazing guest, Benedetto Saraceno. So thank you all for being here with us. Thank you, Benedetto, for accepting the invitation. And before we begin the interview, which I hope will be more like a conversation, I'd like to very briefly introduce this seminar. So, and before I start speaking English, I would like to let you know that CC and subtitles are available in many languages. Para quem está nos assistindo do Brasil, estou só apontando que tem legendas disponíveis no Zoom, no botãozinho CC. Y para todos que nos están acompañando desde Chile o otros países que hablan español, hay subtítulos en español en el botón CC aquí en Zoom. Well, this interview is part of a larger series of seminars organized under the project Transitions, the Ethics and Politics of Psychiatric Deinstitutionalization in Latin America, founded by the Wellcome Trust. This international project is based at King's College London under the lead of Professor Christian Montenegro and carried out in collaboration with the Instituto de Medicina Social at the State University of Rio de Janeiro, where I am actually based, and the Escuela Nacional de Salud Pública, Escuela de Salud Pública de la Universidad de Chile, where our colleague Sofia Bowen is conducting her postdoctoral research. Also with us here is Madeleine Boyton, our project administrator, who is helping us with logistics and background support. So thank you, Maddie, for all your help so far. The Transitions Project aims to create a new global narrative about mental health reforms and deinstitutionalization with a special emphasis on Latin America. By focusing on historical and political process in the two key countries of the region, Chile and Brazil, we aim to explore how different national and international actors engage in psychiatric deinstitutionalization, fostering the closure of asylums and the development of community-based care. In order to go through these historical moments, we organized this series of seminars and have invited inspiring colleagues who have transformed mental health systems and culture and paved the way for us to be here today and undertake this research. So we're very honored to have a special guest for the session. It's our inaugural session, whom my colleague Delia will introduce in a moment. But before we begin, I'd like to invite you to follow our research project on social media. We are in LinkedIn and through our website, which I will share the link on Q&A and which you can find on the background, I think, image that it's behind me, I think, where you can stay updated about upcoming activities and events. Next week, on the 5th of December, we will host a new interview with Professor Marcelo Chimati, who is today's Director of Mental Health of the Department of Mental Health, Alcohol and Other Substances of the Brazilian Ministry of Health. In January next year, we will be back with the second part of our seminar series with amazing guests from the Ministry of Health in Chile, followed by other colleagues representing community mental health organizations and social movements in both countries, but the dates are yet to be confirmed, so stay tuned on LinkedIn and our website. And finally, just a bit of housekeeping for today's session. I would like to let you know that we prepared just 5 questions for our guest, Benedetto Saraceno. After that, we will have the floor for audience questions. So please feel free to type your questions on the Q&A tab at any time or keep your questions to the end of the session when we will have more time for Benedetto to respond. You can put your questions either in English or Portuguese or Spanish and we will make sure we can translate and share the question. Also, I would like to let you know, then the subtitles that are available. I will now pass the microphone to my colleague, Delia da Mosto, who will introduce our guest, and for those who have not yet had the privilege to meeting him. So, Delia.
Thank you, Felipe, for introducing the seminar series, and thank you, Professor Saraceno, for being with us, and also thank you for all of the people that joined us online. I now have the great honor to introduce our special guest. So, Professor Saraceno is a renowned Italian psychiatrist, and throughout his career, he has proven to be a leading advocate for global mental health reform. He began his clinical career in Italy together with Basaglia and Rotelli, becoming one of the active members of the movement that led to the closure of psychiatric asylums in the country. Before joining international organizations, Saraceno directed a public facility for people with severe mental suffering in Milan, and later led the Laboratory of Social Psychiatry and Epidemiology at the Mario Negri Institute. There he pioneered public health initiatives and coordinated technical cooperation projects in Latin America, focusing on community-based mental health approaches. This experience also led to his collaboration with the Pan American Health Organization, where he had a central role in co-organizing the conference, which in 1990 produced the Caracas Declaration, a milestone for psychiatric deinstitutionalization in Latin America, which we'll talk about further on during the webinar. And after that, between 1999 and 2010, he was the director of the Department of the Mental Health and Substance Abuse of the World Health Organization, and he led the development of very important initiatives such as the 2001 World Health Report, and also supported the implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. He is currently Secretary General of the Lisbon Institute for Global Mental Health and Gulbenkian Professor at the Nova University of Lisbon, where he co-directs the International Master in Mental Health Policies and Services. And he is also the former director of the WHO Collaborating Center on Mental Health at the University of Geneva. This is just only a few of the activities that Professor Saraceno did in his life. But I think it's already incredible to hear all of these. And thank you again for being here. And with this, I will pass the microphone again to my colleague Felipe that will start introducing the questions.
Okay, thank you, Delia, and thank you, Benedetto, from being here. Professor, I would like to start back in time with your early years in Italy. And today, psychiatric deinstitutionalization is often framed as a major challenge for mental health policy and a key milestone to ensure quality of care and patients' rights. Yet in the 70s, these debates were still in development, and there were many questions about what it meant, what deinstitutionalization actually meant. So I would like to ask you how these debates were unfolding at the time, and what did deinstitutionalization mean for its advocates and for you when you started your career?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, Delia, for your nice introduction. And thank you to Professor Christian Montenegro for leading the project and inviting me. Concerning your first question, Felipe, I think that the main difference between the institutionalization now, today, and at the time when the discourse started following not only Basaglia, but also other experience in other countries, the main difference was in the prevalent presence of the notion of political commitment. Political commitment was embedded with professional and civil commitment, much more than today. Today, the institutionalization is part, could be part, or should be part of a technical process, humanizing psychiatric hospital, closing down psychiatric hospital, reducing size of psychiatric hospital, moving to community care. But it's a technical project. In the 60s, in the late 60s, in the 70s, there was a political militantism around deinstitutionalization. due to the historical context in Europe and the USA, where movements, social movement, feminism, a social movement of workers, trade unions, political commitment was the everyday part of everyday life. So Basaglia, for instance, was clearly inspired by the thinking of Gramsci, the idea that practical work represents the foundation of any theory, more than the opposite, that a theory represents the foundation of a practical work. This attitude, the influence of Jean-Paul Sartre, the influence of Foucault, made deinstitutionalization part of a broader discourse on what we call today human rights. But this expression was less common in the 70s, where the key word was liberation, was the notion of freedom as a precondition for every technical change in psychiatric care. So I would say that at the time, deinstitutionalization was a political commitment, a technical commitment, a professional commitment, and was meaning closing full closure of psychiatric hospitals. There was no ambiguity that deinstitutionalization was just humanizing institutions, was just reducing the size of institution, was changing the nature of the institution from place for chronic patients to place for acute patients, was closing down. Basaglia used to say, where today there are psychiatric hospitals, we have to put souls, so nothing else can grow up.
Thank you so much, Benedetto. I think it's very important to highlight how we are in a different moment right now, and like how struggles were perceived at the time and how they're perceived right now, and how this same concept can travel throughout time and have different roles, different values. But just trying to go back in time once again and thinking about then your personal experience as well. In the 1980s, you got involved in multiple projects in Latin America, and also as we were mentioning before, with the Mario Negri Institute, and also then after with the Pan American Health Organization. And we wanted to know a little bit more, how did the deinstitutionalization happen within that context, and what brought you in that region in the first place, and what challenges did you encounter, and what did mental health look like in Latin America at that time?
In those years, starting in 1985 till 1995, 10 years, I was working in Mexico, in Bolivia, in Chile, in Argentina, in Paraguay, in Uruguay, in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic, and in Jamaica. Again, the reason, probably the main reasons that moved the Mario Negri Institute, the research institute where I was working, to Latin America, again, was a political commitment, because the person who was leading all the projects in Latin America of Mario Negri was the Secretary General of the Tribunal of People, that was the evolution of the Bertrand Russell Tribunal that in the early 60s. So everything started with the tribunal working on the genocide in Guatemala, India's genocide. And there was a political commitment against dictatorship and the transition from dictatorship to democracy in many countries. So I personally started with the Sandinist movement and the revolution of Nicaragua. I'm talking about the Sandinist of that time. That was a real revolution. Today, the word Sandinist means another dictatorship in Nicaragua. But at the time, the Institute was helping, was supporting the building up of a just, equitable healthcare system, not just mental healthcare system. And I was the person in charge of mental health. So, and for instance, in El Salvador, still there was the military junta. So I was working in a very poor barrio, in a neighborhood that was quite miserable, and very popular. And I was working in a church with another colleague, and we were working in a church with the voluntary young people doing a mix of social development, human development, mental health policy, and clinical work all together. So in a way, deinstitutionalization was seen as a sort of precondition for any work, any possible work, because psychiatric hospitals in Latin America at the time were something unacceptable. I would say that I didn't see any psychiatric hospital that was decent in Latin America at that time. I visited so many psychiatric hospitals, and I was shocked by the inhuman conditions of psychiatric hospitals and by the strong resistance coming from psychiatrists. I must say that the first lesson I have learned in 10 years, in my first 10 years in Latin America, was the main enemy and the main obstacle to any change of psychiatric institutions were represented by psychiatrists. It was not the political condition, was not the Minister of Health, was not the policymakers, were the psychiatrists that were opposing a strong resistance to the critical attitude towards the cathedral of psychiatry, of traditional psychiatry, that was the psychiatric hospital. So I would say that the main resistance was represented by psychiatrists, and the main driving change movement was represented by civil society, human rights advocates, family members, lawyers, human rights people committed, and they were understanding what was happening. And in a way, it was very difficult. And I must say that today, 30 years later, I don't see major changes in Latin America from the point of view of the institutionalization, with the exception of a strong revolution that happened in Brazil with the Movimento da Luta Antimanicomial, that was and still is a very important reforming movement that has brought a clear commitment to closing down psychiatric hospitals, reducing psychiatric hospitals. And many attempts have been done in Argentina, but the only successful story was probably the province of Rio Negro in the south of Patagonia, in the city of Viedma, where there was a special ley de desmanicomerización, where the psychiatric hospital was completely closed down. Another interesting experience was in Dominican Republic, where psychiatric hospital was closed down and replaced by a network of community strategies. Chile, I know that there are many Chileans in this group of the transition project. There was a lot of efforts done by incredible leaders in Chile, like Dr. Alberto Minoletti, who was a great leaders, but also Sepulveda or other people that were committed to change. But in spite of many efforts, psychiatric hospital resisted. Chile is a paradoxical experience. They have built up an extraordinary and innovative mental health primary health care system, which is quite amazing and absolutely fantastic. But still, the traditional institution is there, and it's very difficult to erode the hegemonic role of psychiatric hospital. This happened in many countries. I know that now something's happening now in Peru in the last few years. We did some efforts in Jamaica, but globally, I would say that the commitment was there. There were many important leaders that made fantastic work, but the resistance, a mix of political interests and professional sort of mandarin professional alliances were representing the main resistance to substantial change. The Caracas Declaration of the 90s, that was a very important moral commitment that made an important statement. I think it's very important to have important statements. People will say, well, this was just a piece of paper. No, I think it's very important that there is a piece of paper saying that all human beings are equal, even if it's not true, even if it is not happening. But it's very important that there is a constitution, a moral north representing sort of consensus saying hospital psiquiátrico, manicomio, nunca más. Never again. The transition from this important statement, this moral commitment, and the practical change is a different story. And this should be recognized. But I would not underestimate the role and the importance of moral commitment, even if there is a certain difficulties in making this a real transition. Brazil is a fantastic exception to what I am saying now, because I consider Brazil, due to the dimension of the country, which is a continent more than a country, the most important psychiatric revolution in the world, because the revolution we did in Italy was done in Trieste, which is a small city, 250,000 inhabitants. But the revolution that Domingo Savio do Nascimento,
Capistrano.
Pedro Gabriel Delgado, David Capistrano Filho, what they did was less radical, but broader and broader and broader. And this means something that will remain in the history of psychiatry.
Thank you, Benedetto. We will come back to the Caracas Declaration and the importance of setting this moral importance. But before we get there, there is also something I'm thinking about, which is how between these two continents, coming from Italy and these debates inspired by this political thinking of Gramsci, of Foucault, as you mentioned, and coming to Latin America, where there was this growing epistemology on social medicine and on collective health. And when we look at this movement now, our generation backwards, it seems it was always there. But I was wondering how these ideologies and these different ways of looking at the health system and of rights of people, if they were apparent for you, if coming from Italy when you arrive in Latin America, were these debates easy to identify and to put them in contact with these ideas on deinstitutionalization, for example, or these ideas of community? Were these I was thinking about, were these ideas there when you arrive? Were they easy to see?
There were two systems of values, of positive values,
Mm-hmm.
that met when the Europeans, let's say the Italians experience, but also Spanish experience was important. The experience of Asturias, for instance, was a very important experience that was brought to Latin America. When they met, the European on one side and the Latin American on the other side, I would say that Italians were bringing the radical experience of Trieste. They were bringing the reflection of institutions in the sense of Foucault, in the sense of Robert Castel, in the sense of somehow also the anti-psychiatry movement of Ronald Lang and David Cooper. They were influencing the presence of the Italian and the presence of Basaglia with the famous Conferências Brasileiras, which is a very important book that was very important for Brazil. But we should not, as usual, as European, thinking that we have invented everything and we brought the light to Latin America. The Latin American, they had an important light that we have not. That was the social medicine, the sense of the community care and the primary health care was much more significant in Latin America. First of all, because poverty. So rich countries, high-income countries like Italy, like Spain, or like France, the problem of primary health care is less relevant because in Latin America, sometimes there was the unique care system, the unique existing care system. So we mentioned David Capistrano. David Capistrano was a social medicine leader. He was a pediatrician, was not a mental health person. But David Capistrano, that's very important for the historical reasons, was the person that made possible the approval of Caracas Declaration. Because when I was with Dr. Isaac Levav, we were representing PAHO, the la OPAS, Organización Panamericana de la Salud, in Caracas. At the third day, when it came the moment of the approval, there was a strong resistance from two countries, Mexico and Uruguay. And in the World Health Organization and in the Pan American Health Organization, no declaration can be approved by majority or minority, but only by unanimous consensus. So we were stuck. And the main negotiator that made possible the final approval of the declaration was David Capistrano from Brazil. He was the man who had the political wisdom, intelligence to manage the complex situation. So I would say that the main lessons learned from Latin America was how mental health framed in poverty can help the poor psychiatry of the rich countries.
Mm. Mm.
So somehow there were lessons to be learned. Don't forget that there are important leaders in Chile, Marconi, De La Fuente. There are historical roots of social medicine that represented something that was an important lesson for the Italian and for instance, all the notion that Vikram Patel, in a way, has nicely depicted of the transition from, let's say, task shifting, the task shifting notion is a typical notion of a poor context. Because why you need task shifting? Because you have no enough personnel or staff. So this task shifting, the idea that someone who has less academic degrees, but higher roles, concrete and practical roles in healthcare or in mental health care, it is something that comes from psychiatry framed in poverty. So I would say that it was a win-win situation.
Thank you so much, Benedetto. I think you made it very clear, and I think it's very interesting to see that this contamination. So on one side is the political level that determined the contamination between the Italians that went there, but also like a technical contamination in which you're thinking about what policies might work. But it was very interesting that you started talking about the Caracas Declaration. And I think the Caracas Declaration, well, obviously represents a milestone in the mental health reform in Latin America. And so you said a little bit about the challenges that you were facing when you started it, but going even further behind and thinking about why and how you started it, why was it perceived as so important within that specific moment, considering also the process of democratization that was happening in many countries of the region? And also, why did the Pan American Health Organization at that time decide that psychiatric deinstitutionalization was something that they had to put their attention on specifically in that moment?
Was a strange and somehow unexpected cocktail where different ingredients. On one hand, there was a man that died 1 year ago that was a leading person in all Latin America. That was Professor Isaac Levav, that was an Argentinian psychiatrist and was the leading person in PAHO in Washington. And he was a person strongly committed, not with the institutionalization, but with community mental health care. Mm-hmm. Was coming from the experience of, in Buenos Aires, the early 60s and 70s experience of changing mental health from hospital to community. And he was a strong, committed person, extremely highly respected by the people in Latin America. The second person was me, coming from, well, I was younger than now, of course. So coming with all the, let's say, the enthusiasm and commitment, assertiveness of a disciple of Basaglia, of having been the center of the closing down of psychiatric hospital in Italy, that I was, in a way, pushing Dr. Levav to take an initiative as a PAHO person. And it should be remembered that the Mario Negri Institute, my institution, put money to PAHO to have the Caracas conference, that we were also a donor, not only a technical support, but also financial support. But the third and the main most important component, with so many countries were recently coming out from dictatorship. Brazil was the new democracy. And so there was an atmosphere, there was an environment that was highly conducive for a process of reforming. So we were, in a way, fishing in a sea that was extremely rich of opportunities in terms of cultural, ethical, political opportunities. So in a way, the pressure coming from the Italians, the presence of a leading person in PAHO, and the political environment, mostly in Brazil, but not only in Brazil, Chile as well, for instance, where, in a way, Chile was recently coming at the end of the experience of Pinochet. So the director of mental health was a person coming from the democracy, not from the dictatorship. So these three components, they play a major role. And it should be remembered that the consequence of the Caracas Declaration was not only a moral statement, but was the creation of a consortium of countries. There was a twinning process of a European country, in a way, getting married with a Latin American country. So we had Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Italy, making commitments to support technically Venezuela, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, I think also Bolivia, if I'm not wrong. So there was also a consequence that there was a dynamization that lasted for some years, or at least 5-6 years. There was a technical exchange of experiences between Europe and Latin America, and this was quite relevant. So I am still convinced that even if I'm quite pessimistic about the psychiatric institution today in Latin America, I'm still considering that the Caracas Declaration had and still has positive implication and positive role in Latin American context.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It is a Bible for us in Brazil. Everybody that starts studying or researching about mental health, it's the history. We start with the Caracas Declaration. It's a Bible. It's what we follow. Before we move to the next question, I just want to clarify something. You mentioned this cooperation between the countries, Sweden and Spain and Portugal, and you mentioned the technical cooperation. In what that consisted exactly? For me, that I don't know exactly how PAHO works. So what is a technical cooperation? It's professionals that are traveling and discussing how to implement the reform, or what is it exactly?
First of all, is money. So those countries, those cities, were in a way committing themselves to support their own professional, traveling to Latin America, spending times in Latin America, and providing technical support. So PAHO was not able financially to support the activities of the consortium. So if I remember Oviedo in the Asturias, Madrid with Manuel Desviat, Oviedo with Victor Aparicio Basauri, Andalusia with Marcelino Lopez and Paco Torres, in Valencia with someone else, I don't remember the name. So those cities, and in Italy, Trieste, Reggio Emilia, Imola, Bologna, they were committing money and time of their own professional. They were saying, we will send Dr. Fabrizio Asioli from Reggio Emilia for 1 month to be in Honduras doing the work support that was teaching, was advising the policymakers, in some cases advising the Minister of Health, him or herself. So was a political, financial, and technical commitment.
Wow.
And
It's
Mario
amazing
Negri, yes. So Italy was those cities. Then there was the University of Umeå, is the north of Sweden. And then there was, I think, the city of Lille in France, if I'm not wrong, and some other reality. So this was very important because in a way, facilitated exchange. You should remember that Trieste has hosted at least 150 people coming from Latin America, visiting, staying, spending time, having a stage. So when they were coming back, the way they were bringing some kind of idea, of enthusiasm, of willingness of change. And there were local leaders. I told you about Alberto Minoletti in Chile. He was a key person in facilitating all the process of democratization of mental health care in Chile. Was a fantastic leader. We had people, good people in Brazil, were not just one leader, but they were leader in Rio de Janeiro, they were leader in Rio Grande do Sul, they were leader in the north, in Salvador Bahia, in Sao Paulo. So Anna Pita, many leading figures. So the presence of local leaders meant a lot. And I would say that the lesson I have learned in 30 years between NGOs and then after that, the World Health Organization work, is that everything which is only top and there is no only top down doesn't work. And everything which is bottom up doesn't work. You need top down and bottom up working together. What means that you need leading people having a vision, being thinkers, but you need also local leaders which are really doers, that are capable to translate this thinking in something which is real and concretely applicable to the reality of the country. So otherwise, you have the typical two perversions. I have represented the two perversions. I'm a very perverted man because I have spent 9 years of my life working with a private NGO, like the Mario Negri, doing an excellent practical work in the field with little capacity of influencing the national policy. And then I have worked in WHO, where you have the illusion that you are sitting in a sort of empire and you call on the telephone, hello, China, I want to speak with Russia, give me Indonesia. All this is a lie. So you are top down. So maybe you have the capacity of influencing the top of the country, but you have not the capacity of, in a way, having an incarnation in real leadership at local level. So without the combination of the two, in my next life, I will try to avoid the two perversion.
Okay, so we have a final question from our side and then two questions from the audience. Um, Trying to bring this debate for today, for contemporaneity. We know that mental health, well, it's very different from the time in the 80s and the 70s. It became a very central issue today globally, especially after the COVID pandemic. And I was wondering, what are the challenges for global mental health today? If the challenges are very much related to what you were just saying, it's the presence of leaders and a political view and engagement with mental health. And then just to add, I would like to ask if the institutionalization is still a key concern in global mental health, or if the priorities have shifted. So this just the final question from our side.
First challenge is to be more local than global. I have the sense of a sort of rhetoric of the global discourse. The global discourse, too often, and WHO in this sense has some responsibility, means producing documents and documents and guidelines and guidelines and guidelines. But after years and years of guidelines from WHO, still the psychiatric hospital in Tegucigalpa is a shame. So somehow the local change is urgent. And the global discourse sometimes is an illusion that words are changing the world. The second challenge is not only be careful to asylums, but be careful to hidden asylums. Because now people have understood the psychiatric hospital as it was 50 years ago is no longer accepted and no longer acceptable. But there is also a process of transformation of the psychiatric hospital in a hidden psychiatric hospital. So the problem, if not the hospital, is the institution. So if you reproduce the same institutional logic, which is a logic of misery, which is a logic of violence, which is a logic of no freedom, you can have something which, instead of being called psychiatric hospital of so-and-so, will be called Villa Maria, Villa Lucia, but it doesn't change. So there are hidden institutions that are reproducing the same logic of the traditional psychiatric hospital. Third challenge, so in a way, I consider that still deinstitutionalization is a main topic for the future and for the present. Still, psychosocial discourse is something very vague. I think that we should rethink about psychosocial rehabilitation, not as an entertainment of people doing puppets and ashtrays and singing and doing all these childish things that are typically manicomial, and instead psychosocial rehabilitation is the reconstruction of social contractuality of individuals as citizens. So citizenship is therapeutic. Citizenship comes first of the disease, come before the diagnosis. So in a way, psychosocial rehabilitation is not entertaining patients, is giving patients a statute of freedom and citizenship, of real citizenship. And the big new positive thing that 50 years ago was not existing, we should promote and make real and real every day more real the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. This fundamental legal, moral, ethical, political instrument is something that should be known, taught, applied, implemented. So in my way, in my sense, there is not very much new in the present. The reality is very similar to the past. Psychiatric hospitals still are there. Psychosocial rehabilitation still is entertainment instead of building citizenship. But there is a good, important novelty, which is the CRPD, that is an instrument to be implemented. And there's more and more influential, the big pharma is an influential, playing an influential role, which may be the new illusion that psychiatric problems will be simply, in a way, faced through psychopharmacology and through new innovation in psychopharmacology, which I consider very important innovation in psychopharmacology. But I consider also that the negative influence of big pharma on the education and on the practice of medical doctors still is there and should be, in a way, we should be vigilant. That's it.
Thank you so much, Benedetto. I think it's central to understand also the similarities and also the differences that some challenges and some struggles are still there. Some things are different, and we just wanted to open the floor to some questions that arrived from some of the attendees. Specifically, there's a question from Camila Stuarto Vasquez that I'll translate it to English, and I think it's very relevant to what you were talking right now, and it's also related to how we started this conversation. So the role of the political environment, and she asked, how can you guarantee community engagement and the involvement in general of the community in spaces where, due to the politics of fear, and people are mainly seeking control, and there's no acceptance for difference. And so how can we do that? How can we change? How can we guarantee that the community is involved despite having a very different perception?
I think it's a question about the new time as well, because there was this
Yeah.
political engagement, which you refer in the 80s, but now the political atmosphere is much more guided by politics of fear and so on. So how can we foster community engagement now?
I think that if it was true that 50 years ago, the political commitment and the civil commitment, the professional commitment were all embedded, that should be even more today, because the political environment today, it's not very conducive of democracy and of community life, tolerance and acceptance. So somehow, I think that mental health and psychiatry should somehow be less auto-referential and should be more open to be part of the community debate, of the dialogue in the community. So diversity of people, the sense that there are many people who are different from others, so that the notion of disease is not enough to cover the complexity of the difference among people. All this debate should be brought into the community. In this sense, I think that you are right. The environment can be extremely hard to be more tolerant. But at the same time, there is a proliferation of so many community initiatives, religious, political, cultural. And I am thinking that these oases, they are not talking each other. So the problem is not the lack of commitment, civil commitment of people, but the lack of integration of networking. So I think that we have a responsibility as a mental health professional of networking, community stimuli to democracy and freedom, because democracy and freedom are the basis of mental health. Mm-hmm. So it's our role. It's not the role of someone else. It's also our role, not just our role.
Benedetto, relating to this idea of citizenship and freedom, I want to read two questions from the audience that I think are very much related. The first one is from Layal from Lebanon, and she asks, considering the current context of Lebanon, we are often facing relocation of priorities when crisis emerges, as deinstitutionalization is often considered a development matter and is delayed to a parallel crisis. How can we make deinstitutionalization a priority even in context of crisis? So I think it's how to think about bringing these ideas of freedom in context of war and violence. And similarly, Elaine from Georgia, from Georgian Center for Psychosocial and Medical Rehabilitation, she also asks, Georgia is currently experiencing increasing authoritarian turn, putting many rights-based mental health policy reforms at risk. As political environment becomes more repressive, we are seeing growing fears, censorship, and pressure on civil society. In such context, what strategies would you recommend for preventing mental health systems from being misused as tools of political control? So I think it's this moment in the world that it's thinking about freedom, it's been every time more difficult. So how do we maintain this agenda alive, I think?
Well, I have not the answer.
Yeah.
I have my personal answer, but everyone, and in every country probably there is, and there are different answers. I am convinced that silos, mental health, physical health, social development, education, school, children, adolescents, substance abuse, should be not put in silos anymore, should be in a way part of a unique network of people willing and believing that social suffering is related to disease. In this sense, the lesson coming from Arthur Kleinman and the medical anthropologist at Harvard is very important, because there is no categorical difference between disease, normality, but there is a sort of continuum between disease, social suffering, and normality. And so we have to navigate in a sort of without any separation. So the political commitment as citizens should be not separate from our professional commitment. I don't think that we should be psychiatrists from 8 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and later we are citizens of a country of Georgia or of Lebanon as citizens fighting for freedom, for democracy. I think that there is a sort of embedded condition where we are citizens, even at 8 o'clock in the morning, where we are essentially mental health professional. And then we are mental health professional, even at 8 o'clock in the evening, where we are militant as citizens for democracy and for freedom. This is not playing with words. I think that we should bring our professional knowledge to the general commitment for democracy, and our general commitment to democracy to our professional knowledge. And this kind of interaction is the only way we can try to be at least decent professional and decent citizens in difficult times as we are now.
Wow, this is amazing lesson, and it was great to have you here. We have some further questions, which I think we don't have much time to further explore them. But I would like to thank you, Benedetto, very, very much
Great
for
pleasure for
being
me.
here with us today. It was an honor and a pleasure to be with you.
It was a pleasure with me. It was a pleasure to have people from different parts of the world, from countries where I have most friends, like Lebanon or Georgia, and all of you. So I thank you to Transitions and thank you to this team of Transition for inviting me. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Benedetto.
Okay. And so for all the audience, thank you very much. We're gonna keep the link of our project online. So we're gonna keep it on the Q&A so you can follow up. And please join us for the next sessions. We're gonna have also experiences that we mentioned about Brazil and Chile and the health ministries. So thank you all very, very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.